my name is Ashley Oswald, and today we'll be talking about the strategic use of the first language to support second language acquisition. We'll begin by reviewing my rationale for studying this topic, followed by a little bit of background information, before we delve into what the research says and discuss implications for teachers in the classroom. As a French immersion teacher over the last 9 years, I have observed repeatedly students leaving French immersion. The data you see here comes from Canadian Parents for French. And as you can see that from the year 2018 to 2019, by the third grade, over 10,000 children in Ontario have left the French immersion program. This is an attrition rate of almost 37%, which is extremely high. While there are a large number of reasons that students might leave French immersion, a very common factor is experiencing difficulty. This quote you see here on top comes directly from the French as a Second Language curriculum written in 2013 by the Ontario Ministry of Education. It reads, "Ontario elementary schools strive to support high-quality learning while giving every student the opportunity to learn in the way that is best suited to his or her individual strengths and needs." In the field of second language acquisition, many researchers have studied whether French immersion is a suitable program for children with exceptionalities. I have taught now in 2 provinces, 4 cities, and 4 school boards, and every year I see the same thing. There are students who leave French immersion due to academic difficulty. However, the research in this area is very clear. Dr. Jim Cummins, a professor and research chair at the University of Toronto's Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, began studying this topic in the 1980s. He is a prominent researcher in the field of bilingual education. His studies concluded that there is no identifiable category of student that is unsuitable for the French immersion program. Shown in several French immersion studies, Cummins concluded that while IQ can be predictive of literacy skills in a second language, it's also predictive of literacy skills in your first language and has no impact on oral production of a second language. Dr. Maggie Bruck has a well-studied study where she followed children with learning disabilities from kindergarten until grade 3. And her investigation determined similar results. Children with learning disabilities acquired the same basic skills at the same rate in French immersion as children with learning disabilities do in the English stream. The implication here is that children with exceptionalities can reach their full potential in the French immersion program. In examining this problem through second language acquisition research, I have narrowed down 4 key concepts that we will be looking at. Number 1, proactive instruction. 2, input. 3, output. And 4, reactive instruction. For each of these, we will look at how TransLanguaging can be integrated in order to help struggling language learners. Before we delve into these topics, I would like to provide a bit of background information by reviewing TransLanguaging and its opposite principle, the monolingual principle. At its essence, the monolingual principle is a policy of language separation, while TransLanguaging is a policy of language mixing. The monolingual principle was introduced at the end of the 19th century, making it over 100 years old. It essentially views the first language as an interference in the development of the second. Those who follow the monolingual principle view the development of the second language as entirely separate from the development of the first language. Teachers who subscribe to this way of thinking generally view the first language as a problem. On the other side of the coin, we have TransLanguaging, which has its roots in language mixing. The term originates from Wales, where students attended Welsh immersion programs aimed at preserving the Welsh language while speaking English at home. According to many researchers named here, TransLanguaging is a natural and cognitively complex task that bilinguals tend to engage in. To translanguage or mix utterances, either within or between sentences, requires a firm grasp of both languages, both in terms of vocabulary and grammar. This requires a speaker to make use of all of their linguistic resources. In addition, translation is also a cognitively demanding task, which deserves a valid place in the classroom. TransLanguaging occurs naturally because emergent bilinguals are making use of their pre-existing knowledge from their first language. In this way, the first language actually has a facilitating role and can help in the development of the second language. Code switching is one type of translanguaging that is very common among emergent bilinguals. Code switching involves switching from one language to the other, either within the same sentence or between sentences. I am positive that French immersion teachers are familiar with phrases like "Est-ce que je peux get ma bouteille d'eau?" Things like that. This is a prime example of code switching, and it is very natural and cognitively demanding for children to engage in. There is a lot of research that shows that code switching indicates not a deficit in the command of one language, but rather highly developed skills in both languages. Naturally, code switching seems to increase until about the age of 9, and after that time slowly begins to decline. This is an important consideration for early French immersion teachers. So, monolingual principle or translanguaging, sink or swim? Should students be submerged or immersed in the target language? When it comes to the monolingual principle, Young gives the analogy of throwing someone into the deep end of a pool and expecting them to figure out how to swim. So, are we French submersion teachers or French immersion teachers? The word submerge means to flood, inundate, or engulf, while the word immerse can mean to dip, to dunk, to engross, or to involve. Which one do you want to do? The research is clear. There are a lot of disadvantages to only allowing the second language in the classroom, and a lot of benefits to allowing the first language to be used in a second language classroom. In a monolingual classroom, students are often silenced, confused, and disempowered, while in a translanguaging classroom, they are often empowered, confident, and able to share their ideas. In a monolingual classroom, students are positioned as incompetent, both by their teachers, by their peers, and by themselves. But in a translanguaging classroom, because all students are able to participate and share their ideas, all students are positioned as competent. Struggling students in a monolingual classroom are deprived of their most vital social and cognitive tool, which is language. Thus, they can experience lower self-esteem and lower self-confidence because they are unable to engage in higher order discussions or social interactions. Finally, in a monolingual environment like a French immersion classroom, where students are learning multiple subjects in the target language, struggling students can face barriers to accessing curricular content in other subjects, such as math or science. However, in a translanguaging classroom, the first language can be used strategically to help these students access content in other areas, despite their limited language ability. In 2022, Young studied the experience of students in monolingual classrooms, and they were quoted saying things like, "I felt virtually useless," or "I felt like I wasn't a part of the class." Meanwhile, translanguaging classrooms are inclusive and identity-affirming spaces for all learners, regardless of their place on the bilingual continuum. The most powerful quote I came across in my research is here, that translanguaging liberates the voices of emergent bilinguals. This quote really resonated with me because I have seen this happen firsthand in my own classroom, which led me to my guiding research question. One researcher suggests that when it comes to translanguaging, we should legalize and strategize to unlock its powerful pedagogical implications. Once I knew that it was very clear that translanguaging has its benefits in the second language classroom, I narrowed down my research question. I know that teachers are often being told, do this and do that, without being given any concrete examples of how to do it. So I wanted to bridge the gap between theory and practicality. So we will be looking at how teachers can use translanguaging strategically to support struggling language learners and hopefully retain them in the French immersion program. We will be looking today at 4 areas of second language acquisition research where translanguaging can be used to help support the development of the second language. First, we will look at proactive instruction focusing on engagement, noticing, and uptake. Then we will look at input, focusing on comprehensible input and input enhancement. Next, we will look at output, finding ways to make it meaningful and interactive, and examining the peer negotiation that can take place during certain types of output. And finally, we will look at reactive instruction, and more specifically, corrective feedback. Proactive instruction is based on the premise of the noticing hypothesis, which essentially says that in order for uptake or learning to happen, that whatever the learner is trying to learn needs to be noticed. So, in other words, in order for students to learn, they must first be engaged and then notice what you are trying to teach them in order for uptake to happen or learning. Proactive instruction are practices that are planned or intentional and meant to draw student attention to certain aspects of the language form that they may not have otherwise noticed simply through exposure. So, how can translanguaging be used strategically as a form of proactive instruction? First, we see code switching happening during the presentation phase of a lesson. Code switching is an effective strategy to trigger participation from emergent bilingual students. It can be helpful to begin lessons with instructions or hooks that contain both the first and the second language. Next, we see the explaining of grammatical structures in the first language. One study investigated the uptake of an English verb tense in Malaysian English language learners. The study found that use of the first language helped in the uptake of this more complex grammatical structure. When grammar concepts are complex, using the first language can help alleviate some of the cognitive processing burden that happens when students are listening to instructions or explanations in their second language. This can allow them to fully focus on understanding the concept. Next, we see teachers code switching to provide grammatical examples. Code switching to provide examples of when the second language is similar to or different from the first language can provide negative or positive evidence for students. This creates the opportunity for metalinguistic commentary and for the transfer of knowledge from the first language to the second. Next, we see teaching for transfer through the use of cognates. For example, in Palmer's 2014 study in Central Texas, she observed a teacher using a strategy called cognate cops, where she encouraged students in a bilingual English and Spanish school to notice and celebrate instances of overlap between Spanish and English. We also see translanguaging being used proactively for the instruction of vocabulary. Comprehension texts can sometimes or often include low-frequency words, which students haven't encountered before and maybe won't again. Therefore, these words are not always extremely useful for emergent bilinguals, and therefore it can save a lot of time to provide them with direct translations instead of trying to individually teach each vocabulary term. Tang conducted this study at 18 schools in China and concluded that Chinese was primarily used for translations of English terms. Finally, because proactive instruction is contingent on noticing, the first language can be used to increase engagement and hopefully, therefore, noticing and uptake. In Salmona's 2015 study at an English immersion school in Bogota, Colombia, they studied the use of the first language during a read aloud. The teacher read two different stories. For story A, she read it only in English, the target language. And for story B, she read it out loud in both Spanish and English. Students were much more engaged in story B. They were able to participate, and they actually interrupted the teacher less as well. The use of the first language in the activity was also correlated with students' behavior during the read aloud. Because students were more engaged during the bilingual read aloud, there were less disruptive behaviors that occurred. Salmona's research also showed that using the first language can be more beneficial at different points of emergent bilinguals' learning journey. The L1 is most useful at beginner levels, where the L1 can be used to support and explain the L2. As students acquire more of the target language, use of the first language can slowly be reduced. Next, we will be looking at input, what students see, hear, and read. When considering how translanguaging, or the first language, can be incorporated into input, we can focus on two areas: comprehensible input and input enhancement. Comprehensible input is, simply put, things that students are able to understand. According to Vygotsky's zone of proximal development theory, there are three zones when we think about what students are able to do. There is what they're able to do on their own, and then what they're not able to do. And in the middle lies what they are able to do with help. So incorporating the first language into the second language classroom can expand a student's zone of proximal development and increase what they are able to do independently. This falls in line with Krashen's input hypothesis. Krashen has been a very influential researcher in the field of second language acquisition research. He believed that language follows a natural progression, and teaching advanced skills before a learner is ready will not result in learning. Instead, go only one small step beyond what a student is currently able to do in the target language, allowing this natural progress of language acquisition to occur. Krashen represents this hypothesis with I+1, where I stands for comprehensible input, and +1 stands for the fact that we add one additional level of difficulty. When we look at comprehensible input, we can also consider translations. Emergent bilinguals frequently use translations when they are learning a second language, whether their teacher uses them or not. Translations function as a type of anchor that link the new second language word to an existing idea already solidified in their minds. So with emergent bilinguals, teachers can use translations when speaking in order to make their input of spoken language more comprehensible. It's commonly believed that instead of translating, we should instead be paraphrasing when students don't understand certain vocabulary. However, a 2012 study of Persian students learning English compared the provision of translations with the provision of paraphrasing. In a comprehension test, students who had received paraphrases did equally well as students who had received translations. However, in a vocabulary test, the students who had received translations actually outperformed the students who had received paraphrases. This shows that translations can be either equally or more effective than paraphrases. We can also consider the use of bimodal bilingual texts. This means listening to the first language while reading in the second. In 2015, Lee investigated the effect of listening to the first language while reading a second language text. Use of the first language had a very helpful effect for all learners, but had a significant effect for low proficiency students. Listening to the first language while reading a second language text allowed low proficiency learners to access syntax and vocabulary from the target language more easily. This allowed them to devote more processing power to more complex linguistic aspects of the text. In this way, L1 audio can turn a complicated L2 text into comprehensible input. Furthermore, we need to use input enhancement to increase salience. It's possible that second language learners, even though they might be exposed to certain forms of the language, might not actually learn it. Exposure does not always equal learning, and input does not always equal uptake. Thus, we use input enhancement. Input enhancement is usually done through bolding, underlining, or color coding certain target forms in a text. This is used to draw the reader's attention to a certain language form or vocabulary term. L1 glosses can be an effective form of input enhancement for second language learners that are able to read in their first language. Below, you see an example from a study done by Park in 2018. This is an example of an L1 gloss that he used with Korean students learning English. Students were focused on learning English idioms. On one side was the text with bolded words, drawing attention to idioms contained in the text. But on the left side, students would see the L1 gloss, which is the example that you see here. Each idiom was presented in bolded text, along with a first language transition and 3 examples of the idiom in context. The bolding of the idioms within the text increased salience, while the L1 gloss increased comprehensibility. Next, we will be looking at output and how translanguaging can be incorporated into the output that students are producing in the second language classroom. Output, whether spoken or written, can be incredibly challenging for emergent bilinguals, especially those that are struggling, and this can often lead to silence. So, how can teachers make second language output meaningful, interactive, and accessible? In this area, we will be specifically looking at the use of the first language to produce second language writing. First, we will explore scaffolded first language to second language written output. One way to scaffold or differentiate for our students who struggle to write in their second language is to first allow them to write down their ideas in their first language, and then use instructional aids or peers to help them translate. This allows students to use higher order thinking skills while still building their language skills simultaneously. The act of translating a first language text into the second language is not only cognitively challenging, but can also allow students to build their metalinguistic awareness. Finally, translations allow learners to avoid linguistic difficulties during composition time, which leads to a better flow during the writing process. In a study of Korean emergent English language learners, students who were permitted to write in their first language were actually able to produce English texts with more accuracy and fluency than their counterparts who were required to only write in English. Teachers can also consider bilingual writing. One article describes an English teacher who paired up her students and had them write a bilingual book report. This strategy helped support ELL learners that were still having difficulty expressing themselves in English. She pairs students of different levels together. Students who were stronger in the target language were able to be the leader of writing in the target language, while students who were stronger in the first language were able to be the leader in this area. Together, they produced a book report in both languages. Finally, let's look at the research on collaborative writing. Collaborative writing is a fantastic way to encourage students to produce the target language and engage in output, whether through speaking or writing. Students are paired up and asked to write a second language text collaboratively. While working together, they will engage in a lot of peer negotiation, translating words back and forth from the first language and the second language, trying to figure out how to say exactly what they want to say. Being permitted to discuss their ideas in their first language before translating them allows them to pool their linguistic resources. So, students engaged in collaborative writing generally write texts of greater complexity and accuracy than their peers who had to write solo. Collaborative writing can also show higher grammatical accuracy as students negotiate back and forth which grammar forms are correct. This strategy is particularly effective for students that are struggling in the second language. DeCamilla and Anton in 2012 studied low proficiency students engaged in collaborative writing. They found that while both high proficiency and low proficiency students used their first language for social functions, lower proficiency students also used them for more functional language-related reasons, such as clarifying vocabulary or grammar. Lindberg et al. Also showed similar results. This study, however, had another additional finding. They found that even students who spoke English as a third language were still very likely to use English in peer negotiations in French immersion classrooms while engaged in collaborative writing. It could be that some of the students participating in these studies on collaborative writing would not have been able to write texts of the same degree of complexity or even at all had they not been permitted to use their first language. Finally, let's examine reactive instruction. Corrective feedback is a type of reactive instruction that has been studied quite extensively in the field of second language acquisition, including in terms of the use of the first language and second language during the provision of corrective feedback. So, how can teachers respond to students using TransLanguaging? First, we have recasts in the target language. This is essentially repeating whatever the student has said in their first language, but in the second language. This gives students agency over which language they choose to share their ideas in, and also freedom based on their ability to share their ideas. At the same time, this still allows them to develop their language skills as they listen to the recast of their teacher in the target language. Additionally, teachers can provide explicit feedback in the student's first language. In a study of Korean English as a foreign language students, researchers compared students who received written corrective feedback in their first language or their second. For low proficiency students, the provision of written corrective feedback in the first language was significantly more helpful for students in improving the accuracy and fluency of their texts. In another study of metalinguistic feedback, students who received feedback in their first language showed much better gains in comprehension and also in the awareness of target forms. Finally, in another study of code switching between the first and second language during the provision of corrective feedback, found that students engaged in the most repairs when they received bilingual, mixed, explicit feedback from their teachers. It was also found that the effectiveness of first language corrective feedback varies based on the proficiency of the student. Corrective feedback in the first language is the most helpful for low proficiency students. As students build their proficiencies, teachers can reduce their use of the first language when providing corrective feedback. What are the implications here for teachers? Well, for French immersion teachers, I know there are so many of you like myself who speak English as a first language and French as their second. So you may sometimes feel very hesitant using English in the classroom and feel as though you may be judged by colleagues or administrators. So as long as you're using the first language strategically in the classroom, you can do so confidently. Using the first language in a second language classroom is research-based and is a proven way to help struggling learners in your classroom. If you're unsure of how to go about translanguaging in your classroom, you can try out some of the suggestions that I've given here, such as a bilingual book report, code switching, using a little bit more of the first language during the presentation form of your lesson, or collaborative writing. Oh, and don't forget about cognate cops and giving corrective feedback in the first language to ensure that students understand the feedback that you are giving them. Another important implication for teachers is the idea that the first language can be used as a resource to support the development of the second language. Like any resource, for example, technology in the classroom, this resource has its place, but doesn't need to be used constantly, all day, every day. Strategic use of the first language does not mean that the first language needs to be overused. In a translanguaging classroom, students are still exposed to copious amounts of the second language that has now been made comprehensible with the strategic use of the first language. And finally, keep in mind the ways that using the first language in the classroom can benefit your students outside of their academic development. Positioning them as competent members of the classroom can help them with their self-confidence, their self-esteem, their willingness to participate, and their ability to make friends. Using the first language in a second language classroom can be extremely powerful for students, especially those that are struggling. I would like to return to my favorite quote that I heard during my research, which is that translanguaging liberates the voice of emergent bilinguals. Thank you for listening.